My ex-wife came crawling back after cheating on me and destroying our family for another man, only to realize the man she left us for wasn't what she thought, but I didn't take her back and left her with no one. I never thought this would be my life. I was the type of guy who believed in marriage, in commitment, in family. When I met my wife, Emily, back in college, I felt like I'd hit the jackpot. She wasn't just beautiful, she was kind, funny, and a great listener. We clicked from day one, and I truly believed she was my soulmate. We spent years building a life together, going through all the highs and lows, and I honestly thought that nothing could come between us. We married young, and in time, we had 2 beautiful daughters, Sophie, now 8, and Lily, who just turned 5. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had routines, family traditions, and countless little rituals that made life feel rich and full. Our weekends were full of laughter, pancake breakfasts, and lazy afternoons at the park. Every night, we'd tuck the girls in, and Emily and I would have our us time, even if it was just watching a show or chatting about our days. It felt like everything I'd ever dreamed of. But then, out of nowhere, everything changed. A year ago, Emily started acting differently. It was subtle at first, coming home a little later than usual, talking about her work with more enthusiasm than I'd heard in years, and texting on her phone constantly, sometimes smiling at something she wasn't willing to share. I didn't want to be paranoid, so I brushed it off. I assumed she'd made new friends at work or was just more invested in her career, which I fully supported. I had no reason to doubt her. But the late nights started piling up. There were always reasons, always excuses. I had a work dinner, I went out with the girls, I'm just stressed and need some me time. She began turning down family outings, claiming she was too tired or had something else to do. It hurt, but I tried to be understanding. I'd ask her if everything was okay, and she'd brush me off, saying I was overthinking things. She told me she just needed some space. The change was gradual, but it felt like I was watching her drift further and further away from me and the girls. I started to feel helpless, like I was losing her bit by bit, day by day. Our connection, the one we'd built over so many years, was eroding, and no matter what I tried, I couldn't seem to bridge the distance. Then came the night when it all broke open. I was putting the girls to bed after another dinner where Emily was working late, and I overheard Sophie asking Lily, "Why doesn't Mom want to be with us anymore?" My heart broke hearing my daughter ask that, and it hit me hard. It was like someone punched me in the gut. They were noticing it too. My daughters, innocent as they were, could see that something was wrong. That night, I sat down, replaying everything in my mind. I was anxious, heart racing, unable to sleep. I didn't want to invade Emily's privacy, but I couldn't ignore this nagging feeling any longer. So, I did something I'd never done before. I looked through her phone. My hands were shaking as I read through her messages, and there it was, in black and white, she was seeing someone else. His name was Dave, and he was one of her co-workers. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were explicit, detailing times they'd met up when she told me she was working or out with friends. There were texts where she told him how he made her feel alive, how he was everything she'd been missing. I read about times she'd lied to me and to the girls to go be with him, and I felt the betrayal cut through me like a knife. I don't think I've ever felt so many emotions at once: hurt, anger, humiliation. I couldn't believe that the woman I loved, the mother of my children, could betray us like this. The next morning, I confronted her. I didn't even wait to calm down, I couldn't. When I told her I knew, I expected her to deny it, to maybe show some remorse, but she didn't even try. She just looked at me, almost coldly, and said, "Yeah. I'm seeing someone else. He's more exciting, more successful, and he treats me like a queen. I don't think I love you anymore." I was stunned. I couldn't believe the person in front of me was the same woman I'd built my life with. She didn't show an ounce of regret. She talked about Dave as if he were her savior, as if everything we'd built together was just replaceable. She told me he made more money, he was taller, more attractive, and somehow, that made him better. It felt like my world was collapsing, like the foundation I'd relied on all these years was crumbling beneath me. I tried to hold it together. I was shattered, but I had to hold it together. Not for her. Not for us, whatever us even was at that point. But for our daughters. I couldn't let them see how broken I felt. I had to be strong, even if everything inside me was screaming. Emily didn't waste any time after that. Within days, she filed for divorce. She left with barely a glance back. She didn't seem to care about the impact on the girls or me. I kept replaying her words in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of them. She actually told me, "I don't think I want the kids either. They've become a burden. Dave and I want to enjoy life, and being a full-time mom doesn't fit into that anymore." Hearing her say that about our daughters, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. These weren't just words, this was our life, our family. And she was willing to throw it all away for some guy she barely knew. She was giving up her role as a mother because it didn't fit into her new vision of happiness. How could she be so selfish? The weeks after the divorce were some of the darkest days of my life. The girls couldn't understand what was happening. They just knew Mom wasn't there anymore, and they were furious with me. Sophie would cry and ask me why I didn't fix it, why I didn't try harder to keep Mom home. Lily started acting out in school, refusing to listen to her teachers, and she'd throw tantrums at the smallest things. I tried to explain things in a way that made sense to them, but how could I? How could I make them understand why their mother left, why she didn't want to be with us anymore? They were just kids, they couldn't process it, and in a way, neither could I. The hardest part was when they'd cry themselves to sleep, asking why Mom didn't love them enough to stay. That broke me every time. I felt like a failure, like I hadn't done enough to protect them from this heartbreak. I was angry at Emily, but more than anything, I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for not doing something to stop it. To make matters worse, we had to move in with my parents because I couldn't afford the mortgage on my own. It was humiliating. I was in my mid-30s, a grown man with a career, yet here I was, back in my childhood home, trying to rebuild a life I never wanted to lose in the first place. My parents were supportive, of course, but it was a constant reminder of how much had been taken from me, from all of us. Then, about 5 months after the divorce, when I'd finally started to adjust to this new life, there was a knock at the door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it and found myself face to face with Emily. She looked different. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes hollow, her clothes wrinkled. This wasn't the polished, put-together woman I'd once loved. She stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just looking at me. Finally, she asked if she could come in. I told her no. I didn't want her in my home, in the place I was trying to rebuild with the girls. But she looked so desperate, so broken, that I found myself asking, "What do you want, Emily?" She took a deep breath and began to talk. She told me that Dave wasn't who she thought he was. He'd started drinking heavily, spending money on drugs and other women. She said he was a monster who'd taken everything from her, her dignity, her self-respect, her money. She'd thought he was her savior, her escape, but he'd ended up being her downfall. As she spoke, I felt a strange sense of relief, even satisfaction. But there was no sympathy left in me. I told her, "You chose this, Emily. You chose him over us, over the girls. You made your bed, now lie in it." The girls struggled with the transition too. They missed their friends, their rooms, the life we used to have. They'd ask me why we couldn't go back to our old house, and each time, I'd have to explain that things were different now, that Mom wasn't coming back. It was soul-crushing. She started crying then, real, deep sobs, and she begged me to take her back. She said she was sorry, that she'd made a huge mistake, that she was lost without her family. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. All I felt was the weight of what she'd done, the way she'd torn our lives apart without a second thought. "Why should I believe you now?" I asked her. "You left us for someone you barely knew, and you didn't care about the pain you caused. You didn't care about me. You didn't care about our daughters. Why would I risk it all just because you suddenly regret your choices?" She tried to say that things would be different, that she'd do anything to make it up to us, but I knew better. I'd seen the look in her eyes when she told me about Dave. I'd seen how little she cared when she left. And I knew that even if she was sorry now, I'd never be able to trust her again. I told her to leave. She begged me one last time, but I stood firm. Eventually, she turned and walked away, and as I watched her go, I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, I knew I'd done the right thing. After that night, Emily tried to reach out several more times. She'd call, text, even show up at our house. But each time, I told her no. I had nothing left to give her. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. The girls slowly began to understand what had happened. I sat them down one evening and explained, as gently as I could, that their mom had made some bad choices and that those choices had hurt our family. I told them that it wasn't their fault, that none of this was because of anything they'd done. They cried, of course, but over time, they began to accept it. They stopped asking about their mom as much, and they started to turn to me for the love and support they needed. It took a long time, but eventually, we began to rebuild our lives. I worked hard to be there for the girls, to show them that I'd never leave, that I'd always be there for them. We found a new rhythm, a new normal. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I still felt the weight of what had happened, but we kept going, one day at a time. Looking back now, I see how much I've changed. I'm stronger, more resilient, and I know that I can survive even the hardest of times. The girls and I are closer than ever, and we've created a new kind of happiness, one built on trust and loyalty. Emily still tries to contact me now and then, still tries to make things right, but I know there's no going back. I've moved on, and so have the girls. Life isn't perfect, but it's real, and it's ours. And that's more than enough. My husband, 35M, cheated, left me, 34F, and our kids, 10F, 7M, for another woman, then tried to come back when it all fell apart. I've spent years trying to understand what went wrong. My husband, Mark, and I have been together for over a decade. We built a life, a family, a home. We have 2 amazing kids, a 10-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, who are the light of my life. For a long time, I believed we were happy. We had our challenges, like any couple, but I thought we were solid. I thought we were partners. But looking back, maybe I missed the signs. A few years ago, Mark's job took a turn for the better, and he began climbing the ladder at work. His hours became longer, his business trips more frequent, and his phone was glued to his hand constantly. He'd spend entire evenings texting, always something for work, he'd say. Sometimes he'd work late, sometimes he'd come home past midnight. I tried to be understanding, assuming he was just dedicated to building a better future for us. I can't pinpoint the exact moment things started changing, but slowly, I became less of a priority. Date nights grew infrequent, our conversations grew shorter, and the intimacy that once bound us together was fading. Whenever I'd bring it up, he'd brush me off, saying he was just stressed, that work was taking a toll on him. He'd promised to make it up to me, but those promises never lasted. Then, one evening, after our son's school play, Mark mentioned he had to head back to the office. I offered to bring him some dinner, but he got defensive and said it wasn't necessary. Something about his reaction stuck with me, and that night, I felt this knot in my stomach that I couldn't shake. Weeks passed, and Mark became more distant. The late nights, the work emergencies, the secretive texts, it all started to feel off. I wanted to believe in him, in us, but I couldn't ignore this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. So, one night, when he left his phone on the counter, I looked at it. I was shaking, feeling like I was betraying him, but a part of me needed answers. And there it was, messages with a woman named Vanessa. They weren't work texts. They weren't friendly. They were intimate, flirty, and some were explicit. They spoke of plans to meet up, messages telling each other how much they missed each other. My stomach dropped as I read how he'd lied to me, how he'd spun stories to keep me and the kids in the dark while he built another life with her. When he came home that night, I confronted him. I didn't yell, didn't break down. I just looked him in the eyes and asked, "Who is Vanessa?" For a second, I thought he'd try to deny it, maybe make up a story. But he didn't. He just stared back, like he'd been caught but wasn't sorry. He confessed. Vanessa was a colleague, someone he'd connected with. He told me he was in love with her, that he wanted more than what he had at home. He was cold and distant as he told me this, almost like he was giving a business report. It was surreal. I felt like I was in someone else's life, watching my husband tell me he didn't want us anymore. What hurt the most was that he didn't seem to care about the kids. He barely mentioned them, barely acknowledged that his actions would shatter their world. He'd become so wrapped up in this fantasy that he couldn't see the destruction he was causing. Within a month, he filed for divorce. He said he wanted a fresh start and didn't want to drag things out. It felt like I was disposable, like the family we'd built was just something he could walk away from without a second thought. He moved out, leaving me to pick up the pieces and try to explain to our kids why their father wasn't coming home. The months after he left were some of the hardest of my life. I watched our daughter, who had always been so close to her dad, become withdrawn and angry. She'd barely speak to me, blaming me for not keeping him here, as if I could somehow fix it. Our son started acting out, getting into trouble at school, refusing to listen to me. They were hurting, and there was nothing I could do to make it better. I spent so many nights crying myself to sleep, wondering if I'd failed somehow, if I'd done something to drive him away. I questioned my worth, questioned if I was enough. But eventually, I realized I had to be strong for myself and for my kids. They needed me, and I wasn't going to let them down the way he had. We started to find a rhythm, a new normal. I threw myself into work, spent weekends taking the kids to parks, movies, anywhere to distract them. Slowly, they began to open up to me again. It wasn't perfect, but we were healing, little by little. Then, about 8 months after the divorce, I got a call from Mark. He sounded off, almost defeated. He asked if he could come over to talk. I didn't want him in my home, didn't want him disrupting the small peace we'd managed to build, but curiosity got the best of me. So, reluctantly, I agreed. When he arrived, he looked like a shell of the man I'd once known. His face was unshaven, his clothes wrinkled, and there was none of the confidence he'd had when he left. He started to tell me that things hadn't worked out with Vanessa. Apparently, she'd left him after he lost a big project at work and didn't look as promising anymore. She'd found someone else, someone with more potential, and tossed him aside. As he spoke, he looked at me with this pathetic, pleading expression, almost like he expected me to feel sorry for him. I was angry, but a part of me almost pitied him. Almost. But when he said he wanted to come back, to rebuild what we'd had, I felt a fire rise in me that I hadn't felt before. I told him, "You made your choice, Mark. You chose her over us. You didn't care about me, or the kids, or the life we built. You threw it all away, and now you want to come back because she left you? Because it didn't work out the way you wanted?" I told him I wasn't interested in playing second to his regrets. He begged, said he was sorry, that he missed his family. But I couldn't find any sympathy for him. Not after the pain he'd caused, the nights I'd spent crying, the therapy sessions for our kids, the way he'd discarded us like we were nothing. He asked to see the kids, but I told him that was something he'd have to earn. He couldn't just waltz back into their lives after disappearing and expect forgiveness. Over the next few months, he tried reaching out, tried sending gifts to the kids, but they wanted nothing to do with him. They'd heard the hurt in my voice, seen the way he'd left us, and they weren't interested in his apologies. Slowly, they began to realize that he hadn't just hurt me, he'd hurt them too. They saw that we were stronger without him, that we could build a life of our own. It's been a year now, and while the pain is still there, it's less intense. The kids and I have found a new rhythm, and I'm grateful every day that we managed to come out of it stronger. Mark still tries to reach out now and then, still tries to make things right, but I know better. We deserve better. I'm learning to let go of the bitterness, to move forward with my life. And as for Mark? He's just a memory now, a reminder of what I won't ever settle for again. We've come too far to look back. By trying to be the cool uncle and taking my nephew to an arcade. So, I, 29M, thought I'd do something nice for my 8-year-old nephew, Max, and be the cool uncle for the day. Max is a video game addict, so I decided to take him to this massive arcade that opened up in town. I told him he could play whatever he wanted, and I'd cover the tokens. Big mistake. Max's eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning. We walked in, and I immediately handed over the card loaded with tokens and said, "Go nuts, little dude." I was feeling pretty proud of myself, envisioning Max talking about this epic day for years. So, the kid starts going wild. Racing games, shooting games, claw machines, the works. He's hopping from game to game like it's his own personal playground. Meanwhile, I find myself caught up in this old-school pinball machine that I was actually kind of good at back in the day. After about 30 minutes, I realized I'd lost track of Max. Not a huge deal, since he's still somewhere in the arcade, and it's pretty contained. But after calling his name a few times and not getting a response, I started to get a little nervous. Then I heard it. A loud scream. I rush over, expecting the worst. Maybe he hurt himself? Maybe he got stuck in some machine? No, it was way worse. Max is in the prize room, the place where you redeem tickets for prizes, and he's holding up a mountain of tickets like some kind of triumphant gladiator. I don't know how he did it, but this kid won, like, 10,000 tickets on a single game. I figured he'd grab some toys or candy and be happy, but oh no, Max has his eyes on something else. Something that costs exactly 10,000 tickets. A life-sized stuffed gorilla. Yup. I watch in horror as Max points at it with that innocent little grin, and the arcade worker looks at me like, "Are you sure about this?" Before I could respond, Max is dragging this gorilla out of the prize room. This thing was huge, like 6 feet tall and barely fitting through the door. At this point, I'm sweating, wondering how on earth I'm going to get this thing into my car. Max is absolutely thrilled, naming the gorilla George and saying he wants to take it everywhere with him. I managed to cram George into the back seat, but I can't see out of the rear window, and his arm is sticking out of the trunk. I don't even want to think about what people on the road were thinking as they drove by. We finally get back to Max's house, and his mom, my sister, just stares at me, her jaw practically on the floor. She's like, "Why did you let him get this?" And I have no good answer. I mumbled something about wanting to be the cool uncle, and she just shook her head in disappointment. But here's the kicker, Max refuses to let go of George. Fast forward to that evening. My sister calls me, and I can hear Max crying in the background. Turns out he's terrified of George in the dark because George's eyes glow. They don't, but try telling that to an 8-year-old with an overactive imagination. She tells me to come pick up George because Max doesn't want him anymore. So now I'm the proud owner of a 6-foot stuffed gorilla that I have no room for in my tiny apartment. I've tried to get rid of it, but every time I look at George's goofy face, I feel guilty. TLDR, tried to be the cool uncle, ended up with a massive stuffed gorilla that now haunts my living room.